All right, a Ford, a Chevy, and a peanut farmer. That title will make sense by the end. So we've talked about Watergate, what happened after Watergate with Richard Nixon, the resignation, um, his sort of apology, and but we haven't really talked much about the political fallout and who replaced Nixon, and then who replaced that person. So we're going to talk today about Gerald Ford, but we're also going to talk a little bit about the election of Jimmy Carter. Now, the the more the policy aspects of Ford and Jimmy Carter, we're going to push towards the textbook, the foreign policy, the economic policy. Today, we're really just going to talk about the political history of these two guys and the public image of them and really the outcome of the 76 election. So one thing that you may have noticed when we started talking about Richard Nixon and Watergate was that we kind of skipped over somebody. There was somebody that I had mentioned early, and then they seem to have gone away. And this relates to one of the more popular political trivias in U.S. history, and that is, who is the one president that was not elected in any way or fashion to the White House? And of course, the answer is Gerald Ford, because not only was he not ever elected president, because obviously he was Nixon's vice president. Nixon resigned, he became president, and then he lost the 76 election. But he wasn't even elected vice president. And the part that I never did actually talk about was the fact that Nixon originally had a different vice president. So in 68, he ran with Maryland Governor Spiro Agnew. And then in 72, when he ran for re-election, Agnew was still his vice president. But before Watergate ended, Spiro Agnew was long out of the picture. In October 1973, he resigned because of a bribery scandal. Started when he was still in Maryland, but continued into the White House. He was still taking bribes as vice president. So he eventually resigned. So again, this kind of gives this, to kind of go back a little bit, this gives this overall impression that it's not just Nixon, it's the entire administration that is corrupt. So, of course, Agnew was replaced by Gerald Ford. Somebody, to be honest, that everybody liked. I mean, not everybody may have liked his politics, but whether they were Democrat or Republicans, he was very well liked. When he was actually chosen in December of 1973, the vote was 397 to 35 in the House and 92 to 3 in the Senate. And again, you would not get, like, for instance, today in 2022, there's no way you would get Democrats and Republicans that many agreeing on one thing. But again, there was the sense that Gerald Ford really was a truly decent guy. And so he was the anti-Nixon. He was the anti-Agnew. So this is him with his wife, Betty Ford. At the time, they were, he had been in the House for 25 years. He was a minority leader. And in fact, they were living in just a house that they had built in Alexandria, Virginia. And he was still, just driving himself to D.C. That would have to change once he's vice president, because for security reasons, especially in the post-John F. Kennedy era, you're not allowed to drive yourself anymore. So that would begin to change. But they were just kind of unpretentious people. And when he gave his acceptance speech on December 6, 1973, to be vice president, he very famously said at one point that I'm a Ford, I'm not a Lincoln. Just saying, hey, look, I know what I am. I'm not pretending to be something greater than I am. And that humility and that kind of plain spokenness, even before Watergate had finished, was already something that the public was craving. And even as president, he would be, for a short period, a breath of fresh air. And in a moment, we'll talk about why it was such a short period. By the way, when Ford accepted the vice presidency, at that moment, he assumed Nixon was still innocent. And again, we sometimes forget today, we know everything, or almost everything about what happened. We have all these recordings, so we can track in real time what Nixon knew. And, keep in mind, at that time, people didn't know a lot of what we know today. So he genuinely thought Nixon had to have been innocent. So he would be quite shocked and very upset later as the revelations began to come out. But so if he had known what he knew in 74 and 73, he probably would not have accepted the vice presidency at that point. But again, in August 1974, for the very first time, a president has resigned and the vice president has now become president. He would remain president until Jimmy Carter was inaugurated in January 1977. His vice president eventually chosen was New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, a liberal Republican at that point. A little bit different in politics from Ford, but still very well liked. And again, kind of a very much not a Spiro Agnew, if you will. One weird thing to kind of keep in mind was the fact that when there was a brief moment after January of 1973, when Lyndon Johnson died, until Nixon resigned in August of 74, there was only one president, period. Meaning there was no living ex-president, and obviously there was only one sitting president. Nixon was the only person alive who had ever been president at that point. But and again, this kind of ebbs and flows how many ex-presidents we have. But as health has gotten better and people are living longer, we are beginning to see more and more ex-presidents at one time. Although in the 50s and 60s, there were a number. You still had Herbert Hoover, you had Dwight Eisenhower, you had Truman, you had Lyndon Johnson for a brief, for 2.5 years, you had John Kennedy. But they had all died out. And so Nixon was it. And that is interesting because we do forget sometimes how much presidents lean on previous presidents for advice. And oftentimes we don't even know they're doing this till long after they're out of office. So obviously the President's Club doubles when Gerald Ford becomes president. Because of the circumstances, Ford did not communicate that much with Nixon. That would change later, but during his presidency, he pretty much kept a distance from Nixon. When Jimmy Carter became president, now it's three. You had Jimmy Carter plus Ford and Nixon. Under Reagan, now it's even more. So of course you have Reagan as president, Ford, Carter, Nixon. There were several meetings together. Not all of them were publicized, but they always like to have at least one event where all the ex-presidents show up and you get a nice photo, because as a new president you get that cachet of, look, I'm one of these guys now, so you want to be seen as part of that club. I always like this image because it looks like these like these old man superheroes, which Saturday Night Live actually did a cartoon series. I think it was based on this one image called The Ex-Presidents. But anyway, so once you get to George H.W. Bush, now you got a 5-member club. So you have Bush, Reagan, Carter, Ford, and Nixon. And of course, I love that whoever set this photo up, they actually did put them in chronological order from left to right. Under Bill Clinton, about the biggest this club had been. Unfortunately, I couldn't find an image of all of them together. I'm not sure they ever quite all got together. But this club would not be very large for long. So this is Bill Clinton meeting with former President Richard Nixon. But Richard Nixon would pass away in 1994. He won't be around that long for Clinton's presidency. And one thing I haven't talked about before, Nixon was obviously humiliated by Watergate, never could come back to politics. But he did know a lot about foreign policy, and he understood politics. So presidents did seek his advice, and he actually was the author of several best-selling books. So he still maintained a pretty good, profile. And behind the scenes, he definitely maintained a profile. So again, you might be surprised that all these presidents were meeting with Nixon, but he did know some stuff, despite his moral character. So again, the Nixon part of the club would not last very long. And even Ronald Reagan, I believe actually the same year, 94, he would publicly announce through a letter that he was suffering from Alzheimer's, which had been suspected for a while. Even when he was president, the last year or so, he was clearly having memory issues. And today there is some thought. He was still qualified to be president, but if anybody's ever known some of his Alzheimer's, it does take a while before it fully kicks in. So we'll talk more about this later, but he did have memory issues by the end. But by 94, he really was to the point he couldn't function publicly. So he wrote a letter, and I'll show you that another day. So he would only be in the club for a short period, although he'll still live for about 10 more years, but no one would see him again. So this club is starting to get a little bit smaller. And then under both Obama and George W. Bush, again, we see the club get a little bit bigger yet again. You still have Carter. You still have George H.W. Bush, obviously Bill Clinton, and then George W. Bush. And of course, Obama will have George W. Bush to also lean on. But during George W. Bush's presidency, that's when Gerald Ford will pass away, and that's when Ronald Reagan will pass away. There's no real photo of Donald Trump with the ex-presidents. He did not invite them. They were at the inauguration, but they were not part of that. There never was that sort of moment. And then under Joe Biden, even though with COVID, you don't see. I don't think they've had a real meeting yet, but they all showed up at the inauguration. So Joe Biden, of course, has Trump, which I don't think they'll ever see each other. Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Jimmy Carter still around. I'm recording this in October 2022, and just a couple of days ago, Jimmy Carter turned 98. He doesn't make public appearances much anymore because of his health. Although he still will do interviews. I listened to one just about 3 months ago. It's all audio. You couldn't see him, but he's still clear-headed. And this is the very odd photo of the Bidens with the Carters. And it's just the framing of it, and I think the deep-set chair. It looks like these giant Bidens with these munchkin Carters. But anyway. So again, the club is still it's back to being full size again, if you will. So a little bit about Gerald Ford. I think he's kind of he's been called by many people the forgotten president of the modern presidents. I think he was only around for a relatively short period, although about the same period that John Kennedy was around. And yet we still talk about Kennedy all the time, but we don't talk about Gerald Ford. So a little bit about him. He was born initially Leslie King. His original biological father was not part of the picture. He later was adopted by his stepfather. He would always be a big advocate for adoptions, by the way. So he does later. His name becomes Gerald Ford. Born and raised in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Eventually goes to university for law. University of Michigan. He was actually a major football player there, and in fact was drafted by 2 different NFL teams. This is back when NFL was still very early. To play, but he wanted to go into the law, so he actually did not go into the NFL, but he absolutely could have. So he's one of maybe the only president we've had that could have literally been a pro athlete. And I mention that because it's kind of ironic, the image of Ford, as we'll talk about in a moment, of somebody who was clumsy and somebody who wasn't very smart, and when actually he was a brilliant student and a very good athlete. So he does, like many people his age, he did it, just like Richard Nixon, he does serve in World War II. I believe it will be George H.W. Bush will be our last of the World War II vets. But he served in the Navy. He became a lawyer for a little while and then joined the Navy. And again, this becomes part of politics. Most people joined because they believed in the war, but there also wasn't a realization like, if I don't join, it's not going to look good later, but still. So he does actually have a good service record in the U.S. Navy. When he gets out, oh, by the way, I forgot to mention at this point, he also, because it's important, he does marry a woman named Betty Bloomer, a dancer from New York. She's originally from Michigan, but had studied in New York under Martha Graham. We're going to talk about her a little more in a moment. So he's married by this point, starting to have a family. They'll end up having several kids. And then he runs for the House in 1948. For Michigan, and wins, and will spend the next 25 years in the House, and like I said, eventually makes his way to minority leader. And it was very well liked by both parties, as I've mentioned. He also was part of the Warren Commission. This was the commission to look into the assassination of John F. Kennedy. So you can see Gerald Ford there, just 2 heads over from the left from Lyndon Johnson. And by the way, there's conspiracy theorists have loved to talk about this because Kennedy ran against Nixon. Some people even claim Kennedy stole the election from Nixon. And then Kennedy is assassinated. Nixon was in Dallas that day, by the way, working for the Ford Corporation. Nothing to do with Gerald Ford. And then Nixon becomes president. He resigns, but Gerald Ford was chosen as vice president, and Gerald Ford so people are like, see, it all connects. But what it really is D.C. is a small town. You only have a small group of people who are in power, so of course they're going to be involved with each other. There's going to always be these connections. But anyway, so once we get past Nixon, we kind of enter this brief period in the mid to late 70s of kind of an unpretentiousness. I know we talked about disco, and disco was all about dress and glam. Forget disco for the moment, because that was relatively a small part of America, right? It was important, it was popular, but it was still a small part of America. But this is the age of denim. This is the age of everybody's dressing down. Everybody is kind of low key. And we see this in politics, especially after the corruption of Watergate and the idea of these corrupt elites. There is a purposeful playing down. And this is also the era, I think, I'll go ahead and, because by the way, Jimmy Carter fits this theme as well. In fact, even more so than Gerald Ford. I always look at this period as this is the period of nice people, if you will. Everyone's very gentle, and there's this kind of growing sense of being sensitive, and you think of this is the era of Mr. Rogers and Alan Alda and Phil Donahue. I know these are names that you may be like, I don't know who these people are, but this of the sensitive man and very insightful and thoughtful time. And we see this reflected in the presidency. In the 80s, we'll get much more brash and confident and less inward looking. But again, both of these presidents went out of their way to kind of downplay the pomp and circumstance and ceremony of being president. Jimmy Carter would become very famous for wearing sweaters instead of suits, for instance. And very briefly, because she's actually quite important politically and culturally, and that is Betty Ford. Again, born Betty Bloomer in Michigan, eventually gets into dance, moves to New York, works under Martha Graham, somebody who was big on, having no barriers, no filters. You're completely yourself. And even though Betty Ford eventually leaves the dance, she realized she wasn't quite as devoted to professional dance as she needed to be to succeed. But that idea of no filter, being yourself, very much affected her role as First Lady. Again, she had a great sense of humor. She kind of very down to earth. She didn't mind showing that she could dance. So you get all these kind of crazy photos of her. She could seem to be a ball of laughs, and she was very much. She definitely wasn't, say, a Jackie Kennedy or something like that. She was, again, kind of a regular person thrust into the national spotlight, and a spotlight she never thought she'd ever get. So again, there's all these images and films of her dancing and laughing and making jokes with people. But the two things that make her important, other than just interesting, is first off, 6 weeks into her term, if you will, her role as First Lady, her doctors discovered a lump in her breast, and she did get treated and had them. And again, this is a period, we're talking, 74. This is a period when people didn't talk about, first off, they didn't talk about cancer hardly at all. You definitely didn't talk about breast cancer, and you didn't even say the word breast. But she became very public about her diagnosis, about her treatment. And in fact, again, I'm recording this in October, not to get too personal, but my mom has breast cancer. She and probably will not see 2023 because of it. And so this is obviously, and I think we all have family members or friends or relatives that have, suffered from breast cancer and perhaps even have passed away from it. And of course, October is Breast Cancer Awareness Month, even though anybody who has to deal with breast cancer gets a little tired of seeing the pink everywhere. But again, the fact that we talk about it so openly now, that's Betty Ford. Betty Ford is the one that began this idea. We're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about treatments of it. We're going to talk about early detection of it. And again, my own mom was first detected 9 years ago with it and got 9 extra years because of that early detection. We owe a lot of that to Betty Ford and the fact that she pushed this. We think about Eleanor Roosevelt as being this very politically active First Lady, but really, for the most part, First Ladies were not politically active. They were behind the scenes, but not publicly. Lyndon Johnson, Lady Bird Johnson did a little bit, mostly with historic preservation. But really, Betty Ford was one of the first ladies to really get out there and grab onto a cause and push it. And now that's kind of expected of first ladies. So she kind of helped create the image of the first lady in the modern era, in the 70s and later era. The other thing that she talked a little bit about was actually her role in substance abuse. She had her family did an intervention. Most of this happened a little bit earlier. Some of it happened before she was first lady. Some of it actually happened after she was first lady. But she both had a drinking problem and a pill problem. I think Valium was the main problem. And she did actually seek treatment. And then was, again, this is that Martha Graham influence. She was very upfront about it. She didn't hide it. And again, this is something else that until the mid-70s, you didn't talk about alcoholism. You didn't talk about drug abuse. But you do begin to talk about it in the 70s. And again, Betty Ford is one of the very first people to openly talk about this. This is just a quick little scene from a television movie called The Betty Ford Story. Oh, I lied. Let me come back to this. Oh, darn it. Let me come back to this. I forgot which clip I had up there. I didn't rehearse this. So, sorry. Let me go to this one. This is the clip I wanted to play you.
Well, I don't care what you've been hearing. I do not have a drinking problem. If I were an alcoholic, I'd know it. If I were an alcoholic, the whole world would know it.
Mrs. Ford, you are not here because a couple of doctors have prescribed a few too many pain pills. You're here because you're a prescription drug addict and an alcoholic. Now, it's your choice. Are you going to recognize your problem and do something about it? Or are you going to continue to hide your head in the sand until you finally manage to kill yourself?
Now, again, if you have probably seen a million TV movies, television shows, Hollywood movies, where you have somebody with a problem and then they get treatment and then they deny it and then they accept it. And, it's such a cliche now, right? And almost every celebrity at some point publicly announces that they have a drug problem. And it's almost part of a career trajectory now. That really began with Betty Ford. And this is just a typical TV movie, but she obviously cooperated with it and was very upfront about wanting to talk about these issues in a way that, again, people at that time had not done before. Her working with Gerald Ford, they managed to open up at the Eisenhower Medical Center and out in California, the Betty Ford Clinic, which has become very famous for celebrities who have had alcohol problems. These are some celebrities from the early 2000s. I probably need to update this. Lindsay Lohan, Robert Downey Jr. In fact, I think a lot of younger people forgot that Robert Downey Jr. in the 90s, everybody, he was on a death watch. We all assumed he was not going to make it to even 2000, let alone now, a super healthy guy in 2022. One of the biggest movie stars out there. He was a major drug addict. I think crack been one of the worst. And if you don't know who the guy on the right is, this is David Hasselhoff, famous TV star and Baywatch, Knight Rider. This was an early, sad, viral video of him trying to eat a hamburger. And he's on the ground. He's so drunk, and his kids filmed it as kind of an intervention. But the Betty Ford Clinic is sort of the place to go if you're a celebrity to get off drugs and alcohol. And again, that was Betty Ford. Now this clip, I forgot about it. This was even when she was still vice president. Excuse me, as she was still a first lady. She, again, she had kind of a easygoing personality. She actually appeared on very briefly on an episode of Mary Tyler Moore to tie it into an earlier lecture. Betty Ford was very much a feminist. Again, this is back when feminism did not link to just Democrats or Republicans. It was a bipartisan issue. She was very pro-ERA. She was very pro-choice. So she was very much part of that era that we've been talking about. And there's an episode of Mary Tyler Moore where the character Lou Grant, the boss, played by Ed Asner, is in D.C., and Mary Tyler Moore's character thinks he's showing off and pretending to know people he doesn't. He's trying to convince her that the Fords had spent some time in his hotel room. And so this is a very quick shot of the scene. Mary is talking to Betty Ford, but she thinks it's not Betty Ford, but of course it actually is.
Well, I have to go now.
Well, I just wanted to tell you I'm sorry we missed you.
Look, I don't know who you are or how Mr. Grant got you to take part in this childish charade.
Please just tell Lou we'll have the pipe picked up.
Yeah, but it's really very late, and I'd like to get to sleep, so I'll say goodbye now. Oh, and incidentally, your impression of Betty Ford really stinks.
All right. So one of the things, and Betty Ford played a big role in this, was this idea of humanizing the presidency, being very open, transparent, just being, again, kind of just a regular guy, if you will. As Ford talked about, he wanted to just bring normalcy back, just kind of get back to just regular. I think we kind of, I've seen attempts at this even in our politics in the 2020s after sort of the, all the politics of the Trump era and the January 6th and the 2020 election. It hasn't quite happened in our politics, but that was the thought, was that we would kind of tone it down a little bit. And that definitely was Gerald Ford, and he would succeed at this a little bit. He was very upfront. No more recordings. I'm not going to have any more enemies lists in the way that Nixon had literally a list of enemies. He wasn't going to ban reporters from the White House. In fact, he was incredibly open with the press. They're not going to be very nice to him, as you'll see in a moment. But and as one person said, oh, by the way, and this is Ford with, if for those who are into music, this is George Harrison of the Beatles, meeting with him. And he met with, he was very open with meeting all kinds of people, He's extremely approachable. As one person said, Ford's role seemed to be to clean up the messes of other people. Again, even the Warren Commission had an element of that, coming in after Nixon and kind of cleaning up the mess. There's a famous story of him. Soon after he was president, he was in Vail, Colorado. He was an avid skier. And he, one of his dogs was there with him, and he went to the bathroom, and in this hotel, they were having dinner, and the dog went to the bathroom, and so one of the attendants came to clean up, and Gerald Ford got up very quickly and said, no, I'll do it. He said, no man should have to clean up after another man's dog. And he actually got on his hands and knees and cleaned up the dog, And, that kind of became kind of the image of Ford. He's just a regular guy that goes out of his way to clean up his own messes and such. And we've talked about this already, so I don't want to spend too much time on this, but this is that era, post-Pentagon Papers, post-Watergate, of sometimes you can almost call it integrity chic. There was a real push for politics to be very transparent, very, very clean, no scandals. And of course, it's kind of like the Me Too movement to some degree, because we began to actually see just how dirty politics had been at this point and just how wild these politicians were. So we've talked about almost all of this: financial disclosure laws, public record laws, limit campaign donations. But there also were a whole series of scandals in 74 and 75, not just investigations of the CIA and FBI, which we've talked about, and not just investigations of the Vietnam War, but also just literally the press going after these reporters. Post-Watergate, the press gloves were off, and politicians now were fair game. So, for instance, the guy you see here is Wayne Hayes, a Democrat from Ohio. And by the way, it wasn't just Republicans. The next two I'm going to talk about for a second were both Democrats. So this is Wayne Hayes, a Democratic representative from Ohio, with his secretary, Evelyn Ray. Investigating from his disclosure laws and financial records, they discovered there's this person, apparently a secretary, and somebody asked her, what does she do there? And she kind of admitted that, I can't type, I can't dictate, I'm not allowed to answer phones, I don't really do anything. And of course it came out she was there for one reason: sex. That this was his mistress that he had put on the payroll. So that came out. He had to resign over that issue. Another representative, this time a Democrat from Arkansas, Mills, W. Mills, was found drunk in D.C. Swimming with his stripper mistress. And he too had to resign eventually. Although he was a little more brazen about it. This is him appearing in front of the press after he was caught. And this is him and his stripper girlfriend. So again, and there's lots of these are the two probably more famous ones. There were lots and lots of these kinds of stories coming out. DC was becoming it was a very different place. It was no longer quite the boys' playground that it had been up to this point, and a place to make a lot of quick money through backroom deals. There will still be scandals, but we do see the nature of DC change. So, by 74, after Watergate and even some of these other scandals, there was a real hunger in American society for heroes. And I think we'll see this really come to fruition by the 1980s. The Vietnam War was depressing for people. Some of the heroes of the 60s, like Kennedy and Martin Luther King, were gone, assassinated. There didn't seem to be any politician that had stepped into that role, especially for younger people. Even the movies were very downer and depressing, and and so there was this just hunger for somebody to step into that role of being the moral leader. And oddly enough, there was a guy named Evel Knievel, and I'm sure some of you at least have heard that name. He was a stuntman. The 70s was the era of people getting really into stunts and these big, extravagant feats of danger, We talked about jumping the shark already, and, the TV show was Fonz. I mean, he was doing Evel Knievel on there. So Evel Knievel was this guy that did all these huge stunts. He would jump over, 20 buses and such. But he was also, very patriotic, and he wore a helmet, follow the rules, make sure to wear your helmet, didn't do drugs. He publicly talked about not drinking, although he did drink a lot. And of course, he took pain pills because I think he's famously known for breaking every bone in his body at least once. So in September of 1974, he was going to do this big jump over Snake River Canyon in Idaho. It was this big deal, and it was broadcast all over when he did this. So I'm going to play you a little clip from a documentary about Evel Knievel, and you'll see how this played out.
Thousands have gathered on the canyon's edge, and the event is beamed live on closed-circuit TV into cinemas across the country. At 3:36 p.m., the countdown begins.
3, 2, 1.
At liftoff, something goes terribly wrong. As the sky cycle leaves the launch ramp, the emergency parachutes have prematurely opened, sending it spiraling to the canyon floor.
Everybody, including me, was straining to see through binoculars any which way what was going to happen.
I thought it was all over. I didn't think we'd ever see him again.
And it disappears below the rim of the canyon, and nobody can see anything.
I saw him under the rock, and I went on a walkie-talkie and said, he's alive, go under the rock.
The sky cycle had landed just feet from the edge of Snake River. Knievel had survived, but almost immediately there were serious doubts about what really happened. After all the hype and promotion, there was a suspicion that Knievel had pulled the emergency chute on purpose, that the whole event was one big PR stunt.
Again, this is just a little bit of pop history, and he would continue to be a big star. They even made a movie starring Evel Knievel. But that kind of ended Evel Knievel's reign as kind of an American hero. Well, partly I mention this because on the very same day that happened, President Ford, this is in September of 1974, September 8th, he made this speech.
Therefore, I, Gerald R. Ford, President of the United States, pursuant to the pardon power conferred upon me by Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, have granted, and by these presents do grant, a full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon for all offenses against the United States which he, Richard Nixon, has committed or may have committed or taken part in during the period from July 20, 1969 through August 9, 1974.
And that is a full pardon, by the way. I mean, that is everything he could have done as president, including the bombing of Cambodia and Vietnam. I mean, this is a huge one. And of course, he would later say, you know, as part of that, our fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over. Our Constitution works. A great republic is a government of laws, not of men. You know, so not only, you know, saying Watergate is over with, we're done, but it is truly over with. Because I've pardoned, we're not going to deal with, you know, trials or anything like that. And so just a month into being president, it kind of was over before it began. He would never be able to get out from under this image that there was some kind of corrupt deal, that they must have made a deal. And by the way, a deal was offered by Nixon to Ford. I mean, Al Haig, the chief of staff later under Nixon after Haldeman, does approach Ford and say, look, you know, he'll resign if you promise to pardon him. And Ford did turn it down. But people never could quite get over this, that he must have been somehow corrupt. So in the same way you Knievel, there was that little sense of, did he just fake that? There was a sense of Ford. So this hunger for heroes will continue. And again, this is going to play a role in the election of the next guy. So, I mean, it got so bad that Ford did something that presidents never do. He went to Congress and testified to Congress over this issue.
I assure you that there was never at any time any agreement whatsoever concerning a pardon to Mr. Nixon if he were to resign and I were to become president. The pardon under consideration was not, so far as I was concerned, a matter of negotiation. I realized that unless Mr. Nixon actually accepted the pardon I was preparing to grant, it probably would not be effective. So I certainly had no intention to proceed without knowing if it would be accepted. Otherwise, I put no conditions on my granting of a pardon which required any negotiations. Although negotiations had been started earlier and were conducted through September 6 concerning White House records of the prior administration, I assure.
So again, but there never would be quite any sense of closure on that. Today, we historians who've looked through everything said there was no deal, but at the time, this is going to ruin Gerald Ford as president. I mean, he's still going to be liked. I mean, it's still going to be a close election in '76, but this really kind of sealed his fate. Like I said earlier, he really did try to be very transparent. He probably the only president I can think of that has talked to the press as much as Gerald Ford is, ironically, somebody that's seen as being very hostile to the president. It was actually the previous president, Donald Trump. Actually, I think spoke to the press maybe as much as Gerald Ford, but Gerald Ford did long interviews over and over. He would allow press to come to the White House and film an entire day of presidents, something that presidents had never done before. But, you know, some of these interviews are pretty rough. This is a photo from an interview by Tom Brokaw, later to be the main evening news anchor for NBC. And at one point during the interview, Tom Brokaw asked him straight up, are you even qualified to be president? You know, there are people who think you may not be up for the job, you know, and that was something nobody had ever asked a sitting president before, that kind of direct sort of question. Today, that may not seem so shocking, but in '74, that, again, people didn't talk like that to a president, the press. And you are seeing kind of a sign, you know, there is a growing lack of respect for presidents, especially by the press. This is kind of a new type of journalism that's emerging. I mean, I'm a big fan of journalism, and I actually personally think some of the stuff we see emerging in the 70s was a good thing. You know, not accepting leaders were, but investigating, looking, questioning. But I will say, I do think Gerald Ford was treated pretty roughly, and turns out probably unfairly, because he was a very honest person. But this negative image of Ford after the pardon, again, would plague him really until he passed away. He never quite got out from under this. Ironically, since the 70s, most journalists from that period have done a 180. Journalist Richard Reeves, who wrote a book called Not a Lincoln, but a Ford, using that quote as a critique of Ford, a pretty harsh critique. He wrote in the 70s. In the 90s, he actually said he apologized. He said, I shouldn't have wrote it. I was wrong. He was actually a good president. This is Bob Woodward, the person who broke the Watergate scandal, talking about the pardon and his reaction to it.
Gerald Ford had been president for 30 days, roughly, taking over from Nixon, who'd resigned the month before. And Ford went on television early on a Sunday morning, some of you may remember, and announced that he was giving Nixon a full pardon for Watergate. Now, he went on television early on a Sunday morning, hoping no one would notice. But some people were alert and awake and noticed, not me. I was asleep in a hotel room in New York, and my colleague Carl Bernstein called me up. And he said, have you heard? And I said, I haven't heard anything. I was asleep. And Carl truly has the ability still to say what occurred in the fewest words with the most drama. And he said, blurted out, the son of a bitch pardoned the son of a bitch. Even I got it. And at the time, thought there was something really corrupt about the pardon of Nixon. There was an aroma of a deal that Nixon would resign with the guarantee that he would get a pardon, and then Ford would get the presidency. And there was the question, which persists in American history, thank God, of justice. Why does the guy at the top get off and 40 people went to jail? And if you look at the history of this era, when Ford ran in his own right in '76 against Jimmy Carter, he perhaps lost because of the suspicions of the pardon and the aroma, and the Carter, talked about the Nixon-Ford years, and, said that in a sense, Nixon and Ford are somewhat the same. And so I thought this for a long time, and then had the chance to do a book that came out, I think in 2000, so it was 25 years later, The Legacy of Watergate in the presidencies of Ford through Clinton. And I called Gerald Ford up and said, I'd like to talk to you about the pardon, figuring, there was something undisclosed about all of this, and he would politely or directly say, I have a golf tournament to go to. I don't want to, can't talk to you. And instead, he said, sure. So I interviewed him for hours in New York City, or at his home in Colorado, or his main home in Rancho Mirage, California. Again, the luxury of time. Had a full-time assistant, went to the Ford Library, got the legal memos about the pardon, interviewed everyone who was alive about the pardon, read all the memoirs, the contemporary coverage, did a draft, went back to everyone. What really happened here? What is the history of the pardon? And to shorten it, it was Ford who convinced me, quite frankly, who said, look, I pardoned Nixon, not for Nixon, not for myself, but for the country.
For time, I'm going to go ahead and stop there. But again, even Bob Woodward, the guy who broke the Watergate story, later admitted, it was the right thing to do. It allowed America to kind of move on. I think it still rankles people. I know a lot of students over the years, when I've talked about this, get very that's just not fair. That's not fair. But again, I mean, we can already see the lingering January 6th investigations and how that's still consuming the nation. And you know, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be doing that, but I mean, but you can imagine how big Watergate would have just continued to be. So again, this was Ford's argument. We have to move on to just for the sake of the nation. By the way, Tom Brokaw actually spoke at the funeral of Gerald Ford. I mean, most of these reporters later realized kind of how lucky they were, how much Ford was willing to talk to him, how honest he actually was. So there is, again, kind of a historical change in his perception. Another thing that Ford dealt with is just a little more kind of pop trivia a little bit. It could have been very serious, though, was that he did have 2 different assassination attempts on him. And again, sadly, from the 60s through the 70s, this was Today we have mass shootings. Back in the 60s and 70s, we had the shootings of famous people. This is an era that would end with the attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan in '81. But what made Ford a little bit unique, and maybe it's appropriate that it was the 70s and the era of the women's movement, they were both women, which is not something we normally see. One assassination attempt was Squeaky Fromm. She was one of the Charles Manson family. If you may know for that, she did attempt to shoot him and was caught. And then Sarah Jane Moore, a woman who had mental issues. She had come out of a mental institution. 2 weeks later, she tried to shoot him, was taken down, and eventually sent back to a mental institution. By the way, they're both free today. They are both out, but they both did try to shoot and kill him. Obviously, they did not succeed. So we're getting into the 1976 election. As I said, some of the details of the policies I want you to read about in our textbook. But building up to the 76 election, I mean, Republicans really knew that more than likely there's no way they're going to win because of the Watergate scandal. But they were, of course, going to try. Gerald Ford, who didn't really want to be president, as happens with most people, once they get to the White House, they don't want to leave. So he's like, I'm going to run. And, again, a sitting president and really having done a pretty good job, the thought was, well, I'll be the nominee. Well, actually, he was challenged for the Republican nomination by a California governor, a former actor, somebody that was still seen as kind of a joke when it came to national politics, and somebody who was very right-wing. This is a time when conservative, with a capital C, were not in the mainstream of politics for the most part. Barry Goldwater had briefly risen to major politics, running against running against Johnson, and lost. But this is right before conservatism really became a major force in politics. So Reagan was seen as this kind of dark horse candidate. He doesn't get it, but he actually comes fairly close. This very much hurt the Republican chances, and Reagan would eventually come out for Ford, but never really enthusiastically. And throughout the next several years, Reagan is basically gearing up for 1980. And in fact, today, most people say that he knew he wasn't going to get in 76, but what he was doing was setting up his campaign for 1980. So we'll be coming back to Reagan in a different lecture. But Ford is trying to run for re-election, and this is one of the campaign ads. I always think they're interesting how different they are from today.
Our long national nightmare is over. Our Constitution works. Here, the people rule.
He came to the office of president in troubled times. He reminded us of our strength. Confident and candid, he began an open administration. Now, quietly and firmly, he is leading us out of the worst recession in years. Rather than loose promises, he has made hard decisions. Rather than frantic spending, he has had the courage to say no. Inflation has been cut nearly in half. The worst of the recession is over. Over 2 million more Americans are working than at the bottom of the recession. Inflation slackens. Recovery continues. President Ford is your president. Keep him.
And again, you can see one of the themes there is the economics. Economics will remain a theme throughout the 1970s, all the way up until the early 80s. One of the problems that plagued Ford was this image that he was clumsy, that he, constantly falling. And he does very famously fall a couple of times. These are both from the same incident. It's actually hard to find these clips, by the way. This is a really short clip from a compilation, a comedy compilation of presidential gaffes. It only has a little bit, but you can actually see a bit of this, and you do hear some comedic commentary.
Raindrops kept falling on their heads as Gerald and Betty Ford arrived in Austria. And President Ford kept falling on his head, first in Salzburg in front of Austrian Chancellor Kreisky. Hi, thanks for dropping by. Then in Michigan on a trip up the same stairs.
Again, that's about all I could find. So, but there are several, at the time, there were several stories about him falling. He's golfing and hit somebody in the head with a golf ball. One time he let his golf club go. And again, the irony is he actually was an amazing athlete. It's just these are a couple of falls, and it became this image that he was, again, extremely clumsy and maybe not very smart. And partly because he was kind of plain spoken and he didn't make elaborate speeches and such. So right at this time, during this 75, 76, during the presidential election, a brand new show had come out on a late night show. There was almost nothing came on after about 11 o'clock on network TV other than Johnny Carson Tonight Show. So on Saturday nights, all they used to show on NBC was Carson repeats. So they decided, why don't we do something for young people? Let's have a young person show. So a show was supposed to be called Saturday Night Live, but they couldn't use that title because there actually was another show called Saturday Night Live on ABC. They were just starting up their own show. They had the same idea. Very different. It's also a comedy show, very different, hosted by a guy named Howard Cosell, very famous sports broadcaster. So initially they had to call it Saturday Night. Later they added the live part because the other show only lasted a few weeks. That's why even today, if you watch Saturday Night Live, they always start with the same thing. They have kind of a cold opening, some comedy sketch, and at the very end of it, they look at the camera and go, live from New York, it's Saturday night. And I always thought that was really weird growing up because I was like, yeah, we know it's Saturday night. But that was because that was originally the name of the show, and they just kind of kept that phrase. They never updated it. And of course, this was a show with people mostly in their 20s. These were the baby boomer kids. Now they're, for the very first time, we see a baby boomer focused comedy show. And, Saturday Night Live continues to be, to this day, they're on their 47th season now, a kind of a factory for creating comedians, from Will Ferrell to Tina Fey to Christine Wiig to Amy Poehler, Seth Meyers, Jimmy Fallon. Going back a few years, John Lovitz, Dana Carvey, Mike Myers, going back to the 80s, people such as Eddie Murphy comes out of Saturday Night Live. But the initial group of Bill Murray, Chevy Chase, Gilda Radner, Dan Aykroyd, John Belushi, Jane Curtin, and Garrett Morris, they were superstars in the 1970s. They were seen as hip, they were seen as young, they did drug humor, they did sex humor. This really was stuff that did not appear on TV up to this point. Their very first episode, which before the show really had come into its own, they really weren't quite sure what the show was. The comedian George Carlin was the first host. They even had the Muppets on there for a while. They would have musical guests, but eventually it became this kind of what it is today. But it also, from the very beginning, was always political. And it did play a big role in the election, actually. This has been the one legacy of Saturday Night Live. They do affect elections. So here is a little bit of a sketch of Chevy Chase, the actor Chevy Chase, who's still around, doing Gerald Ford. But he's doing him in a way that the joke is he doesn't look like him, he doesn't act like him. That's part of the joke.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
My fellow Americans, I have called upon the networks tonight to make two pressing issues clear to the American public. Number one, the possible default of New York City And number 1, my stand on the Ronald Reagan announcement. Hello. Hello. Hello, Nesson. I can't hear you. What, are you in the pool? I guess the other phone's ringing. I don't know. All right. Firstly, the default of New York City. Let me be clear on my feelings about this. As president, I will change my mind wherever I want. Hello, hotline. Anwar, just a second. I'm on the air right now. I'll get you a kissing girl, okay? Hank, can you talk to Sadat for a minute? Thank you. The point is...
And you get a little bit of the humor there. I mean, it's really kind of just goofy humor, but they did this every week, this kind of humor. And it did start to give this impression of Ford as he would fall all the time, he would be clumsy. And again, the idea that he wasn't very smart. And Ford's not going to help this, as you'll see in a moment. But, I mean, this really did have an impact, especially on younger voters. Ironically, Chevy Chase would later leave Saturday Night Live, go to Hollywood, develop a cocaine and pill problem and a drinking problem. And guess where he went? Betty Ford Clinic. Guess who he met there? Gerald Ford. He often helped out. And they, ironically, became friends years later. Which does speak a little bit to the character of Gerald Ford. You know, instead of putting Chevy Chase on an enemies list, he played a role in have Chevy Chase healthy. So all of this is going to open up the way for the Democrats. But Democrats need somebody new. They don't need Wayne Mills, Wayne Hayes, or Representative Mills, and people sleeping with strippers and mistresses on the payroll. They need somebody who is an outsider. And I think that you really would never see this person rise to the presidency at pretty much any other time. This was uniquely a time when somebody like a Jimmy Carter, a peanut farmer from Southwest Georgia, Plains, Georgia, could ever have actually this quickly risen to the presidency. So Jimmy Carter, who did grow up on a farm. I mean, he wasn't poor. His family, they had sharecroppers. They did run a successful peanut farm. But he grew up there, married a local girl, Rosalind, became Rosalind Carter. He then joined the Navy, actually became the captain of a nuclear sub. I mean, he actually was very good at logistics. He was good at physics. He was good at math. And that was going to be the career. But when his father died, he realized, that he was asked to come run the farm. So he does. His wife, by the way, was not happy to be back in Plains. But then starts to get into politics. First at the state legislature level, but then actually makes his way to being governor. This has actually been something that helped him, but also has kind of hurt him a little bit. So in 1970, we see a whole series of governors in the South, including Reuben Askew of Florida. But these guys that were Southern, but were post-civil rights kind of guys. They were anti-Jim Crow. They were what we called governors of the New South. But Jimmy Carter, I think was the top of these. And so when Jimmy Carter ran for president, he would campaign all over Georgia. And there were really almost two campaigns. If he was speaking to a black audience, he would talk about civil rights. He would talk about Jim Crow. If he talked to a white audience, he wouldn't be pro-Jim Crow, but he would say things like, I support traditional Southern values, which was kind of a wink, a dog whistle to Jim Crow. So this is shocking to a lot of people during his inauguration in 1971 as governor of Georgia when he said this.
At the end of a long campaign, I believe I know our people of this state as well as anyone could. Based on this knowledge of Georgians, North and South, rural and urban, liberal and conservative, I say to you quite frankly that the time for racial discrimination is over. Our people have already made this major and difficult decision, but we cannot underestimate the challenge of hundreds of minor decisions yet to be made.
So, I mean, he is publicly saying Jim Crow is going to be over in Georgia. And there were a lot of Georgians that were not happy about this decision. Former Governor Marvin Griffin of Bainbridge, Georgia, who actually is the one that signed into law putting the Confederate flag on the Georgia flag, felt extremely betrayed by this. But this also goes a long way, not only to helping Jimmy Carter. I mean, the fact that he said this is what's going to allow him to be president. Because at this point, Southern politicians were all seen as these racist, backward politicians. So suddenly, this guy, I mean, the same thing happened to Lyndon Johnson, where Lyndon Johnson stood up against against Jim Crow in the 1950s, which did the same thing. But this also is going to help Georgia. Businesses are going to be much more comfortable investing in Georgia because of this. But again, there were a lot of people that were pretty upset, and they felt that Jimmy Carter kind of, pretended to go one way, but then really was the other. But he was kind of the real deal. He does seem to have meant a lot of this. So Jimmy Carter really, almost from the moment he becomes governor, is thinking of the White House. He's a very nice guy, very approachable guy, but, he is extremely ambitious. And so he always had his eye on the presidency. So he really played up this idea that I'm easygoing, I'm nice, I'm approachable. I mean, the smile, the peanut and the smile start to become the image of Jimmy Carter when he's running for president. He's really portraying himself as, I am not Washington. I mean, he's one of the first politicians to really do this. Everybody does this now. Everybody pretends they're not a Washington insider. By the way, the fact that he wasn't a Washington insider is going to be a problem later, but that's another lecture. So here's one of his ads.
I'm a Southerner, and I'm proud of a heritage that shows concern for the working men and women who are the backbone of our great nation. These are the people who are often cheated by an unfair system of government. These are the people forgotten by the present administration, while the influential and powerful get special favors. When I'm elected president, that will change.
We in the South can help by voting for Jimmy Carter, a leader.
So he doesn't shy away from his southernness and his rural roots. Again, he's trying to show, like, look, I am not like all these politicians up there with all their money and all their connections. I'm just a regular guy. So again, people like him. It's funny today that we do have this image of Jimmy Carter in this very negative way. We do forget how popular he was. By the way, this is I actually have this. In fact, I'm looking at it right now on my shelf. This is a song. Political ads crack me up. This is actually a song that played on Southern radio in support of Jimmy Carter. So let me play you a little bit of it.
From way down yonder in the peanut land comes Brother Carter with his goober plan. Wants to make himself head goober for the next 4 years. Got a goober plan to erase all of our fears.
Yeah, and this was a pro-Carter song, by the way. Of course, goober is an old word for peanut. And, even when he was governor, he was already, kind of making himself known. This is him on a show called What's My Line, where people try to guess who somebody is and what their career is.
In the meantime, would our first challenger enter and sign in, please? X. Panel, all I can tell you about Mr. X is that he provides a service, and we will now show the audience who our guest is and what his line is. And let's begin the questioning with Arlene Francis.
Well, they're crazy about your service. Would I be?
About my service?
Probably.
I think so.
Is it a service that has to do with women?
Yes, it certainly does. Not enough.
Anyway, so just so again, he's been running for president for a while, and as I was about to say a second ago, it's interesting that today, really the last 30 years, there's always been this sense of not wanting to be another Jimmy Carter. I have students all the time. I just sneeze. Sorry. Okay. Students all the time, they'll say, oh, Jimmy Carter sucks. And then you ask, like, well, why was he so bad? I don't know, he just sucks, you know. And we are going to get into some of his problems in another lecture, so don't worry, we're not gonna whitewash him. But it is interesting because we do forget just how popular he was in 75, 76. I mean, he wins the election and was actually popular for his first couple of years as president. We'll talk about what happened. But again, it is kind of ironic today that he is seen as somebody everyone kind of wants to stay away from and not be the next Jimmy Carter. But again, at the time, he was really seen as the hip candidate, even though he was very quiet and very religious and very old-fashioned in some ways. But he, you know, openly talked about drugs and you know, maybe needing better policies towards drugs. And he met with, you know, rock and roll stars. And in fact, the next lecture, I'll talk a little bit about, you know, kind of how hip he was seen by younger people and by Hollywood and by the music industry. I mean, he was the candidate that Rolling Stone magazine supported as president. He even gave an interview to Playboy magazine, which, you know, to be fair, compared to stuff today, was actually pretty tame. But in the 70s, that was seen as still, you know, ooh, Playboy, that's dirty. You know, and the running joke with Playboy magazine is that if you got caught with an issue of it, you would tell people like, oh, I just read it for the articles. I'm not looking at the pictures of naked women. And, you know, what's funny is that you really could have been just reading it for the articles. They actually really did have real, you know, writing in it. I remember the first time I actually saw one when I was, I guess I was 6th grade. I remember it was in school and I was trying to look at it real quick and I remember I was like, I couldn't find the dirty. I was like, what's all this writing? Where's the good stuff? And I only had like 5 seconds to look at what I was looking for because it really was a real magazine that just happened to do this other stuff. Some of you may know the movie Christmas Story about Ralphie and the BB gun. Well, that story actually first appeared in Playboy magazine. Anyway, so Jimmy Carter did an interview with a guy named Robert Scheer, who was a big deal journalist, and they did the interview, a long interview, and then Robert Scheer was like, okay, I have this interview, who wants to buy it? And Playboy paid for it. So to be fair, Jimmy Carter didn't actually know it was going to be for Playboy magazine when he did the interview, but it came out and it, you know, he owned up to it. It did affect, I mean, it came out, technically its date is November, but it actually came out in October. And it did actually hurt him a little bit. There were some people that felt betrayed that he was willing to do this. And in the interview, he does talk about a couple of things. One thing about Jimmy Carter to keep in mind, he was the first major politician to openly talk about his religion. You know, he was a Southern Baptist, although he later resigned from the Southern Baptist organization over racial matters and kind of joins a more independent Baptist group. But he would use a term that most Americans were not familiar with, especially outside of the South. He was a born-again Christian. And a lot of you may not realize that that was kind of a weird, unique term. You know, even other Christians like, what do you mean born again? What does that mean? Again, this kind of Southern style Christianity was just now starting to become mainstream. And so, but this idea of talking about his faith so openly, most presidents were religious and were mostly, you know, as far as we know, they were all Christian. We haven't not had a Jewish president yet, or a Muslim president yet, or an atheist president yet. I think we've had a couple that have it, like Jefferson, but they didn't admit to it. But they didn't openly, I mean, they would mention God, they would pray a little bit, but they didn't talk about it. The idea was that was considered bad manners. You're going to alienate voters, and we're supposed to be tolerant of all religions. So if you talk about your religion too much, that was seen as wrong. Carter, it was controversial that how upfront he was about his religious beliefs. And now politicians can't talk enough about it, it seems like. They just talk about it all the time. But that was a new thing. And again, it was this kind of, not quite fundamentalist, but this Southern, you know, the idea of testifying, you know, your sins and being upfront about your flaws. And, you know, that people were fascinated by this. And they were, it kind of made them like him because, again, you weren't hearing Nixon talk like that or Ford even talk like that. But it also, they were curious about it. So the interview constantly asked him about this. And they said, you know, well, have you ever sinned? And he was like, of course I have. And, you know, and they said, have you ever, you know, been with other women? And he said, no, but I have lusted in my heart for other women. And it's funny because some people were offended that he talked like this, but actually most people just thought, oh, what an easy, I mean, that's it. You thought about it, and that's all. And you consider that a major sin, So in some ways, this is exactly the kind of image people wanted. There was one presidential debate. This was, the first presidential debate since Kennedy and Nixon in 1960, and that was the very first presidential debate. Today, this is such a common thing. This was still new, so this is only the second time this had happened, and this is where Gerald Ford, who's already seen as clumsy, and Saturday Night Live was basically putting out there that he wasn't very smart. I mean, which wasn't true, but that was the image. And then this debate, for some people, confirmed this. So here we are.
Mr. President, I'd like to explore a little more deeply our relationship with the Russians. Our allies in France and Italy are now flirting with communism. We've recognized a permanent communist regime in East Germany. We've virtually signed in Helsinki an agreement that the Russians have dominance in Eastern Europe.
I'm glad you raised it, Mr. Franco. In the case of Helsinki, 35 nations signed an agreement, including the Secretary of State for the Vatican. I can't under any circumstances believe that His Holiness the Pope would agree by signing that agreement that the 35 nations have turned over to the Warsaw Pact nations the domination of Eastern Europe. It just isn't true. There is no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and there never will be under a Ford administration.
I'm sorry, could I just follow? Did I understand you to say, sir, that the Russians are not using Eastern Europe as their own sphere of influence and occupying most of the countries there and making sure with their troops that it's a communist zone?
I don't believe, Mr. Franco, that the Yugoslavians consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. I don't believe that the Romanians consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. I don't believe that...
So you can see the reporter Max Franco literally did you just say that? Like he's almost smiling, like, oh my God, you just said. It was not a smart thing to say. As anybody who's looked at a Cold War map shows, the red is basically the areas that Russia, the Soviet Union, controlled at this point. The areas in blue were the areas they didn't control. We talk about the Berlin Wall, which is only in Berlin, but almost as a symbolic steel curtain, if you will, or iron curtain, between Russia and the rest of the world. What Ford is doing there, he's making a very subtle diplomatic point, because he knows the whole world's watching. So if he says, yes, there is Soviet domination, then he is basically giving Russia Eastern Europe, right? And so some of these countries were absolutely controlled by Russia. Others had agreed to be, to ally with Russia, but they still did technically have their own government, like Poland and Romania, even though they were allied with Russia. And so, and he's hoping that eventually they will break away from Russia. So he's trying to say, hey, look, Poland, we got your back. We know you're independent. You can make your own decisions. Hey, Romania, we got your back. If you want to make your own decisions, you can. So he's making this, again, a relatively subtle diplomatic point. But to the voting public, it just seems like he's just totally out of touch. Like, what are you talking about? And this is something we're going to see in later debates, is there's a big difference when you're running for president, but you're not president yet. You can say whatever you want, and you can criticize whatever you want. But once you are president, so this always hurts people running for re-election, because now you're in the job. First off, you know what's really going on, and you can't talk about it. But you also know that every single thing you say has worldwide repercussions. So you have to be so careful what you say, and that's what you're seeing here. Again, he's making a subtle point, but it does not come off well. And he could have said it a totally different way. This, coupled with Saturday Night Live, coupled with the pardon, is going to doom Ford. I mean, he still does pretty good in the election, but he definitely is not going to win. Senate Live, I'll just play a quick clip of this. They did their own sketch, an 8-minute sketch. I'm not going to play the whole thing of the debate. I just want to play a little bit of how they were portraying Jimmy Carter versus how they were playing Gerald Ford.
Complicated issue, and I'd like to break that question down into 2 parts, if I might. The first part, of course, is the eternal question why that has plagued philosophers from Socrates to Thomas Aquinas to Bob Dylan. Now, I could not begin to answer that question in the allotted time here. Of course, the second part of the question is, do I pose the B-1 bomber? Yes.
Ms. Montgomery, a question for Governor Ford. Oh, I'm sorry, President Ford.
Yes, Mr. President, this week you admitted making a mistake in the last debate when you asserted that Eastern Europeans are autonomous and independent, and that they don't consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. Certainly anyone can crack under the pressure of these debates and say something incredibly dumb. But to set the record straight, could you describe what you saw on your last visit to Poland?
Well, Miss Montgomery, last year I visited the capital of Poland, and let me just say from the outset that Milwaukee is a beautiful city at that time of year. And I sense their very independent and autonomous spirit, much like the voters of our own northwestern and northeastern urban centers. But because of Soviet domination, the Poles don't seem to have the equipment that we take for granted here in the great United States. Excuse me.
Just for time, again, I just play a little bit, but you can see how they're portraying Jimmy Carter as being very intelligent and very verbose, and he's very intellectual, and then of course Gerald Ford not so. And again, this is just a comedy show. It really did have an impact. The election actually is a little bit closer than you might have imagined, which also shows that Ford maybe could have won this, had he not done the pardon, or had he, maybe not said some of these things, and you can see it's very much an east-west divide. He's coming from Michigan, and he's much more allied with the further west. It's also a little bit of a southern-northern divide, except for Virginia. Carter sweeps the South. He is a Southerner. He's not going to sweep the South in 1980. But, again, if you look at the electoral votes, they're actually a little bit closer than you might have imagined. But obviously, Jimmy Carter does emerge as president. And I don't want to spend too much time on him because we're going to do a whole lecture just on Jimmy Carter. But he does do something during the inauguration that a few other presidents have since imitated. During the inauguration parade, he gets out of his car. Secret Service did not know he was going to do this, and they were not happy that he did this. And he starts walking. He even goes and starts shaking people's hands. And he's making a very clear message. I trust you. There's been assassinations. Even Ford was shot at. But I trust the American public. And he's really trying to send a brand new message out. And of course, by the way, I have to point out the Peanut Brigade from Georgia that also marched in this. One last thing, I'll actually spend more time on this next lecture, but I do want to say it just to kind of close up the lecture and kind of go full circle here. So again, draft dodging was a huge debate. What do we do? The war's over with now. What do we do with these people who had run away? Some are in jail. Some are up in Canada. Do we let them back home? Do we try to punish them? So his very first act as president was to pardon the draft dodgers, if you will. The argument basically being, if we can pardon Richard Nixon, which is what Ford did, I can pardon these young kids who were scared to go to war, a war that many people disagree with. And again, he's really setting himself up as being very different from the previous administrations. So we'll talk a little bit more about this decision and the fact that it actually hurt Carter a little bit. But that will be enough for today. So thank you, and we will pick up next lecture with Jimmy Carter.